I sincerely apologize for not being in Bedford in person. Suffice it to say, I'm jealous of you all under the big top there. This talk is part of a project with myself and John R. Hall, my co-author, which uses alternative social temporalities, including the apocalyptic, as a way to analyze how climate futures are constructed between the social domains of religion, science, and the state across historical periods. In addition to emerging literature, including that of several conference participants here, it builds off John's work on the apocalypse and my own work on climate science and government. Let me begin with two guiding assumptions about climate and apocalypse. First, accounts of climate vary in relation to how social actors imagine and interpret their situations, a climate projection, if you will. Such accounts historically, as now, have involved one or another attempt to impose a particular order to nature, ranging from intimate to global scales, and not always reducible to a temporality bound to clocks, timelines, or even beginnings or ends. A guiding historical puzzle of this talk is how we got to a stabilized or normalized view of climate over the 19th century to a catastrophically destabilized view of climate and climate change today. Second, regarding the apocalypse, anxieties about the future are embedded in alternative ways of construing the apocalypse. The basic motif of apocalypse opposes synchronic religiosity centered on human existence in the eternity of time, as Durkheim famously discussed in the case of totemic religious experience. However, the apocalypse has many variants, related also to strategic and diachronic social temporalities that organize social meaning and domains of action. One accomplishment of modernization efforts over the past 2 centuries was to contain apocalyptic anxieties about a future marked by the end of the world as we know it, substituting institutions by which to rationalize temporality diachronically, that is, into a future that could be anticipated, demarcated, planned, and governed accordingly. And yet today it is a commonplace cultural trope that post-apocalyptic imaginaries involve survivalism under dystopia, often climatic catastrophe followed by a new totalitarian world of terror, suffering without end or reversal. What many consider a crisis of scientific authority in the US, paired with such popular cultural distillations of apocalypse, invite us to historicize the bases of alternative social temporalities. In this presentation, I limit myself to how the apocalyptic and salvation have come to be figured scientifically, especially in relation to Protestant Christian religious movements and political economic developments in the United States context, again with a focus on the former half of the 19th century. We begin with climate futures as they featured in Protestant apocalypticism. At its inception in the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation exploded with apocalyptic imagery, and some Puritans undertook emigration to escape the Babylon of the Roman Church to build a heaven on earth in New England. In this context, climate knowledge helped to make legible the work of Providence in a context otherwise marked by extreme hardship and vulnerability to unanticipated weather. As William Wood wrote in 1634 concerning, in his book, The Prospects of New England, "With divine pleasure and blessing," he writes, "English constitutions would thrive in the area's medicinable climate." The Pilgrims' redemptive quest to establish a city on the hill collapsed by the 1650s, but theological threads of colonization became deeply sewn into subsequent U.S. expansion across North America, extending the errand in the wilderness. On the one hand, waves of revivalism in the early and mid-19th century, what historians call Great Awakenings, filled some settlers with new light, enthusiasm, and a premillennial conviction that the second coming of Christ would occur before and indeed launch a millennial kingdom on earth. On the other hand, post-millennialists held that Christ would return only after God's followers built the millennial kingdom, so their project pushed any apocalypse at least 1,000 years into the future, leaving in its stead an increasingly diachronically organized world rationalized via clock and calendar. Rough-hewn, land-hungry pioneers pushing westward dealt with precarious life on the frontier, where the quest for salvation had an immediacy wrought by drought, floods, disease, crop failures, the unknown in general, and battles with Native Americans who sought to block their colonization. The pioneer focused, at least initially, was on survival in hostile lands. Salvation, therefore, was an immediate concern, and in hard circumstances, pioneers were especially susceptible to premillennial formulations about the last days. By contrast, postmillennialists sought to build the kingdom of God on earth, a collective project especially given to the rationalization of conduct, diachronic temporality that Max Weber identified within the Protestant ethic. Theirs was a civilizational project to tame a wilderness and to bring to it a Christian order. How did millenarian mission relate to climate as understood in the time? Leaving aside the often direct religious significance drawn from weather events, a millennial social temporality shaped how people viewed climate as a feature of providential nature that impinges on human history. In particular, diverse social actors sought to improve the climate-society relationship. To use the famous preacher Alexander's terms in 1840, the mission, quote, to fill up the interior with all light and goodness until the knowledge of the glory of the Lord cover the whole earth. This was expressed in religious conversion into a purified and expansive order that could express divine immanence within the apocalyptic present. Mormon theology, especially after migration to the Salt Lake Basin, similarly viewed Zion as the preparatory improvements through which Christ, in the upcoming last days, would build his temple. Already in 1834, Mormon leader Parley Pratt interpreted Genesis 1 in apocalyptic terms. He writes, "We learn in Genesis that there were neither deserts, barren places, nor stagnant swamps. No part of it was located in the frigid zone, so as to render its climate dreary and unproductive. The whole earth was probably one vast plain, well calculated for cultivation." End quote. After God's wrath would rain down elsewhere, he reasoned, the prophesied land of Zion would be, quote, renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory of Edenic climate once again. For others in a more postmillennial interpretation, Western climates indicated divine revelation already in the here and now. As Presbyterian minister Lyman Beecher claimed in 1835, quote, extending from the Allegheny to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the lakes of the north, the West represented, quote, the largest territory and most beneficent in climate and soil ever prepared for the habitation of man. He continued, I perceive how God, who seeth the end from the beginning, had prepared the West to be mighty, and yet still wieldable. Still others were more attentive to the work of making climate so prepared. For physician Benjamin Rush, temperance could rebalance the effects of climate on health. He reasoned that the natural causes of disease, chiefly those of climate, were modified by, in his terms, moral causes that may be rectified through individual and public discipline. Ohio medical geographer Daniel Drake, writing in 1834, also a temperance activist, held a similar vision of improving the climate-society relationship through medical and social reforms that might reveal the providential development of the West as, in his words, a new world of man in the depths of the new world of history. Stephen Scrimshire recently discusses how apocalypse encompasses, in his words, not only eschatological or temporal disclosure, but also cosmic or spatial revelations. In the case of the early to mid-19th century American West, an apocalyptic temporality situated experiences and evaluations of new climates and territories as habitable and improvable by reference to a radical break with history and embrace of a spatially expansive apocalyptic present. But revelation and providential destiny, or millenarian mission, were not unique to the religious domain. How did scientific practices engender a discourse of climate in relation to these similar colonial and state-building developments? Parallel to restorationist clergy and postmillennial theologians, physicians and natural philosophers employed a logic of science to measure and evaluate through historical and statistical means the pattern developments of nature and its relationship to human society. Over the course of the 19th century, climate became a scientific category within such an evaluative context. Some Europeans had previously, in the late 18th century, interpreted American climates as degenerative to human capacities for civilization, understood as a social state achieved on the basis of natural climatic history, and stabilized especially through cultural practices specific to racial types, in their terms. In this context rife with climatic determinism, the primary aims of those developing meteorological records and climate statistics in the early US reflected an anxiety concerning Europeans' health, moral, and civilizational and racial futures. These aims included explaining and curing diseases exhibited in racially and geographically specific circumstances, as well as evaluating possible changes to American climates, again understood as a metric of civilizational projects. Over the course of the 19th century, efforts to stitch climate knowledge into larger tapestries of state territorial expansion helped to construct Western territories as possibly ordered spaces, containing salubrious or healthy landscapes, and scattered with seeds of pre-civilization awaiting cultivation. From the standpoint of natural philosophers, frontier settlers, and state officials, such progress was hardly inevitable. And yet movements towards improvement of wilderness by cultivation, of savage-like behavior by social reform, and of public health by climate-specific medical police, they would denounce the spectre of degenerative climates and degenerative social forces before they could take hold. As Army surgeon and climatologist Samuel Forey put it in 1842, quote, political institutions and social organization often struggle successfully against climatic agency. Now, what Forey meant here was, in his terms, that Anglo-Saxon whites had achieved a racial type on the basis of centuries of a congenial climatic influence and subsequent civilizing practices in Europe, and that this improvement process may be advanced in the US on a continental scale. Like articles of faith circulating through networks of itinerant preachers and tent revival meetings, matters of climatic fact likewise circulated through US society as a way of evaluating or advancing providential colonial destinies. Unlike apocalyptic revelations, however, scientists ordered time and climate in clearly diachronic terms. Such terms were critical to developments within the domain of the state, through which apocalyptic temporalities were to be contained and by which climate could be stabilized as an object of science and a component of governmentality. Civil religion by the mid-19th century inflected apocalyptic temporality, especially the historic mission of an expansive nation, into ritualized political discourse and state-making practices. Therefore, anxieties regarding degenerative or unhealthy climates, like those regarding imminence of the Christ's second coming, gave way to a rationalized view of climate and a more ambivalent significance of apocalyptic climates to the developments in nation-state building. Seeing like a state does not mean state actors reject apocalyptic temporalities or cosmic visions of rule, but they often seek to contain them, insofar as they remain unwieldy to strategic and bureaucratic governing of territories, time, and social relations. Recall the slave rebel Nat Turner's confession. In his words, "It was plain to me that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men. On the appearance of the sign, the eclipse of the sun last February, he reasoned, I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons." Such interventions of the apocalyptic into political order, notwithstanding, millennial discourse articulated with state strategies, especially to expand territory and facilitate settler colonialism in the American West. What came of climate, therefore, through the process of state formation? With developing meteorological observation networks and collecting information, especially of unknown climates in the West, sought to record, register, and tabulate their findings. Military medical officials compiled their weather logs to evaluate hospital design, soldiers' proper regimen, and especially the effects of climate on army diseases. Federally sanctioned explorers were similarly charged with evaluating the habitability and security of those areas. Meteorologists by the 1850s emerged as state-sponsored scientists in large part on this basis. Improvements to the climate-society relationship for revivalists may have represented an apocalyptic break in the temporal economy of divine movement within history. But for state actors, knowing climate and securing providential expansion were usefully contained when climate could be represented as an orderly system, the dynamics of which could be made legible in diachronic time. In this way, the dialectic between unknown climates and apocalyptic temporality was contained through efforts to map climate futures onto increasingly demarcated territories and calendrical representations of time and nature. So in the elective affinity between religious post-millennialism and secular manifest destiny, a program of climate stabilization came to predominate in elite US culture. The pursuit of climate knowledge and programs of salvation could proceed separately, yet reinforce one another, and without science seriously considering climate futures as distinct from the trajectory of progress. Although I can't expand on it here, this construction of climate as a stable, normalized, geographic category developed further through a clear affinity with industrial capitalism, especially prominent in the development of agricultural climatology and weather prediction by the turn of the 20th century. To be clear then, it is this historical stabilization of climate that gets so destabilized by global climate change. And just as this stability has involved the scientific channeling of apocalypticism and providence through the state, climate change now involves the dialectic reshuffling of social temporality across the domains of religion, science, and the state yet again. Of climate change by the mid-20th century meant that prior assumptions of stability had begun to be overturned. But the dominant logic of positivism meant that knowledge about climate changes continued to be understood as a component of general scientific and social progress. Developments of longer-range forecasting, weather forecasting, and climate modification programs, to cite two important research agendas, articulated with the spirit of post-World War II positivism. Thus, when climate futures again became important to science, they were embedded within a strategic temporality that subjected them to calculation, or in the case of climate control, tactical intervention. As with post-millennial religious future, the secular future of climate came to matter as a site of strategic anticipation. Indeed, early studies into anthropogenic global warming treated it as either a social good or subject to rational technical management most of the time. However, this progressive secular future was strongly undercut by historical and scientific developments in the 1960s, especially the Cold War nuclear threat, its possible catastrophic climate impact, or nuclear winter, and global warming studies that began to emerge by the late 1960s. Challenges to the positivist discourse of progress through climate science occurred on several fronts. The discourse of modification in climate modification previously involved studies into weather manipulation and efforts to modify climates. Now it shifted from a story about progressive mastery of the future to a restoration narrative, thus the landmark U.S. President Scientific Advisory Committee in 1965, their report, Restoring the Quality of Our Environment. Investigations of what, in a turn of phrase, became called inadvertent climate modification, they treated human social emissions as pollution, disturbing an otherwise natural equilibrium. Mathematical investigations, moreover, of large-scale and long time-scale atmospheric processes also rendered climate dynamics as possibly chaotic, displacing the prefigured order that many scientists believed they would eventually uncover. Modification not as mastery, but as restoration, chaos, nonlinearity, and emergingly catastrophe. Such were the temporal shifts of climate science against its own positivistic base. Climate science today thus faces a tension between a legacy of secular positivism and simulations of futures entailing possibly catastrophic geophysical, ecological, and social developments. Dominant approaches to climate change policy have clustered around constructing scenarios, providing one way to contain apocalyptic catastrophe by placing scientific constructions of the future on the axis again of diachronic time and policy decision-making characteristic of modern bureaucratic order. Leaving aside for now the clear possibility of invoking a theological or agnostic form of dominionism, visible in Donald Trump and among Christian premillennialists sometimes, which rejects climate science outright, governance by scenarios yields the strategic capacity to evaluate climate future alternatives and to securitize them. For state actors, climate change can be either quantified in monetary terms or qualitatively assessed as trade-offs in a balance of burdens versus future threats, including to national security, economic growth, and energy and humanitarian crises. These considerations rest on a central logic that folds analysis of climate dynamics into a policy economy of risks, impacts, costs, and benefits. For many climate scientists, however, framing the implications of research within the confines of diachronic temporality does not make sense. When envisioning the civilizational significance of abrupt, irreversible ecological change, issues of salvation loom large. Thus, climate scientist James Hansen argues in 2009 for sweeping regulation of fossil fuels to sustain even the grim hope of maintaining a barely habitable planet in coming centuries. His scientific papers emphasizing nonlinear feedbacks produce sea level rise and reject envisioning global warming impacts as incremental developments subject to the tweaking of policymakers. If a sustainable human civilization is to persist, climate society imbalance requires restorative action, Mark Linus argues in his 2011 book entitled The God Species. Restoration to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide climate boundary of sustainable human society, to be specific in his case. As of now, such prophetic disclosures are less likely to affect the dominant climate policy regime, insofar as they obscure efforts to render climate futures legible diachronically. Yet clearly such changes in climate expertise indicate a temporal fracture between positivist science as a basis of diachronic treatment of the future and apocalyptic science concerned with collective salvation. Apocalyptic disclosures advanced by climate scientists may inspire diverse actions, of course, like religious visions, helping to advance or fragment collective hopes for salvation in the face of suffering and cosmic precariousness. For climate scientists, as with Christians who reject premillennialism, saving individual souls is not what is at stake here. It is the planet that must be saved if humanity is not to face a dystopian collapse of civilization as we know it. Yet for science to chart a path for salvation in the face of anticipated apocalyptic developments would clearly be a disruption of power relations in both the domains of religion and within the state. Among scientists themselves, a postmillennialist style of hope flirts with such extreme strategic interventions like geoengineering the planet. Only several decades ago, scientists were the harbingers of progressive secular developments, often indifferent to religion, much less salvation or apocalypse. We have yet to understand how institutionally authorized forms of future construction, whether scientific or religious, may develop broad alternatives to the currently polarizing discourse that divides scientific projections from religious meaning, salvation of the Cartesian human from survival of human ecologies, and from futures characterized by end times apocalypse from many people's ambivalent orientation toward anything but the here and now. So the question remains, whence a future that escapes the traps that have beset both modern science and religion, historically and today? Neither in itself nor with the other will science or religion be adequate to the global institutional challenge of climate change. Yet the dialectic of the two over the climate apocalypse is important to such concerns because it makes starkly legible how actors in religious and scientific domains are reimagining future relations between human culture, knowledge, and ecological experience. Thanks a lot. I welcome your questions and comments.
Okay, we're going to try and get Zeke on Skype now. There he is. Hi, Zeke.
I can see you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah?
And we can hear you. It's working well.
All right, good.
Okay, so I'm going to ask people, we've just finished looking at your recording, so I'm going to ask people if they have any questions.
All right, great, thanks. Thank
Questions for Zeke? No questions? I think one person is asking, where's John Hall?
I can hear you, yeah.
One person asked, where is John Hall? They wanted to see John Hall.
John is watching this from his house in Santa Cruz, but he couldn't be here.
Okay. Questions? Zeke, we do not have any questions for you.
No questions.
Oh, there's one here. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Question from Richard.
Hey, one thing I was wondering was because I was quite intrigued by what you were saying about the advent of religious language in a lot of previously secular scientific discourse. To what extent do you think that that's something which sits in consonance with religious presentations of apocalypse, and to what extent would you see that as something which is now so dissonant that no agreement between those two different kinds of catastrophism can be possible?
So by that, you're specifically talking about recent developments in climate science and the sort of adoption of a salvation narrative, just to clarify?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like it sort of demands some speculation on that question. I mean, I think there's some movements within climate science, towards religious engagement. Now, it's not exactly over, certainly not over religious orientations to the apocalypse, but it is more about the failure of politics by traditional means. So I'm thinking of a paper written in Science a couple of years ago. I'm blanking on the atmospheric scientist involved in it that is calling for sort of calling on religious authorities for the capacities for mass mobilization of popular opinion. And so I think the elements of fruitful relationship between religion and science is happening, and it can't be written off. Whether those visions of apocalypse are indeed compatible, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, just to follow on for that, I know that some people here will have met Joe Webster before because he was involved in one of the previous activities. But Joe Webster, I don't know if you have come across his paper on engagement, skepticism about climate change among fishermen in Scotland, much of which is on the basis that what it's presenting is a false eschatology, and I think that's very interesting. But I'm kind of thinking, surely there has to be another side to the story here, where in a sense this convergence of eschatologies might be productive rather than something which would necessarily lead to contradiction. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Are there other questions?
There's another question from Chris Rowland back here.
Great, thanks.
Hello, thank you very much. This question is coming from a biblical studies background, and I'd just simply like you to tell me what you think apocalyptic temporalities are.
So I'm approaching it, perhaps from a different perspective, but essentially what I'm looking at apocalyptic temporality is as a social temporality, insofar as it organizes how people approach their social experience in the here and now in reference to the end of the world as we know it, essentially. And of course, there's multiple formulations of that. And then I think that the significance of the way that we draw that out as an ideal type in the period that we're looking at in relation to, what in our formulation we're calling diachronic temporality, is that there are always multiple registers of time, and part of the development of climate knowledge within diachronic temporality is a foreclosure or a containment of apocalyptic climates, which climate knowledge is, in various historical circumstances, climate has been pinned to apocalyptic futures. But I would welcome your elaborated critique on that for sure.
Some of us here today have been querying the baggage which the term apocalyptic can bring with it. And I wonder if that's relevant to what you're saying, because, well, let me just put it in this way. So you have somebody like James Hansen or Kevin Anderson who are giving dire warnings about what's going to happen unless we get our shit together. And I worry that sometimes people like that are called apocalypse mongers or what have you, when it seems to me what they should be called is heroes, and people who are daring to tell the truth and face reality, which is not the same as prophesying doom. It's saying it's a hypothetical, right? Unless we so and so, then such and such. Do you empathize with my concern here? And if you do you think that we should be cautious about kind of the way that we liken scientists to some religious eschatological figures, etc.?
Yeah, I certainly take note of that tension. I think my approach to science and to scientists in this study is not to draw definitive boundaries around prophecy or prediction. In sort of the heroic sense. In a word, I'm very sympathetic to to those that sort of point to nonlinear feedbacks and those sorts of things. And as I mentioned in the talk, I think that given the policy, the orientation to time within policymaking, that those scientific interventions are likely to be underplayed. I mean, this has been shown time and time again within the cases of IPCC reports and their uptake in policy, that it's bureaucratic planning that cannot deal with those kinds of scientific interventions. So calling those apocalyptic is not to, it's certainly not to, denigrate them or to say that they're sort of on par with, fantasy or anything of that nature. But calling it apocalyptic science, if anything, sort of casts it into relief with other orientations to time, which, as others have noted, may or may not be useful or practical in dealing with an issue like climate change.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got one last question, Zeke from Ariel Hesiod.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Zeke. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. If I understood you correctly, you suggested at the beginning that the colonization of, say, Massachusetts and other parts of North America was interpreted through a providential lens by contemporaries, which, if so, is uncontested. But could you clarify, when does science seem to be coming into your story much later in the 19th century? Is that right? Or have I misunderstood
Sure.
you?
No, it's correct.
Yeah, in which case, my question would be, why isn't it not much earlier in the story? Because one of the imperatives that's also driving the colonization is early modern understandings of science. For example, a Baconian great instauration in tandem with the providentialism, and that really what I'm suggesting is that the science should come earlier into your picture, as early moderns would have understood it.
Sure. I'm not as familiar with, at least in my own work, with sort of early modern climate knowledge, although I've read a lot of those works. I mainly sort of wanted to frame. I wanted to use sort of Puritanism and emigration as a way to sort of frame a basic understanding of later developments and manifest destiny on which they were based. It's not climate knowledge, and I used a quote from William Wood in the mid 17th century, and climate concerns around climate were, I think, roughly compatible between really the mid 19th century and the mid 18th century, at least. Concerns around climate and disease, concerns around habitability, concerns not quite race, but concerns around national constitutions in their terms, concerns around climate change in early America. Others have written on that. I wouldn't say that science only comes in later, but it was that specifically. I just kind of carved out a piece of time in the early 19th century to look at that.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I know we're running out of time. I could come back, but I know we're.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
Great.
Okay, Zeke, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Stu. I apologize I can't be there. Thank you for listening.
Next time we'll see you here.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sam.